Hello, welcome. Today we're going to mark an essay, and we're going to mark it using the Azim Premji University Philosophy rubric. Now that rubric is available on Moodle or from one of the faculty, but sometimes it's useful just to see someone using the rubric. You can see it in practice and get an idea of what's behind all of those words. So here's our essay. What is the strongest objection to utilitarianism? Can it be overcome? That's the question that was given to the student. Here's what the student did with it. Utilitarianism was an idea thought up by John Stuart, blah, 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 blah. All of this is what you might call fluff. It doesn't help us establish an answer. It doesn't help us work out what the strongest objection to utilitarianism is. It doesn't help us work out whether it can be overcome. It's just fluff. It's also fluff that's false, by the way. John Stuart Mill didn't think up utilitarianism. The name's thought up by his teacher, and it's a much older idea. But the point is really, this is just nonsense. Well, not nonsense, it's just useless. Cut all of this out. It's tremendously unimpressive. First sentence, give your answer to the question. This is the strongest objection to utilitarianism. It can be overcome that way. Launch straight in there. So the student's off to a bad start. Down here, the student draws the distinction between normative ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. And this is an important distinction. And the student has it roughly right, but it's not precise enough. Normative ethics is the study of systems of morality which systematize applied ethics. Applied ethics is the study of judgments. So normative ethics then would be something which systematizes the study of judgments. On this vision, normative ethics is like a university administrative system. It's systematizing a study. But that's not right at all. And that's just because the person's been too sloppy about their definitions here. Likewise, metaethics is about questions about morality rather than about morality itself. Well, it's in the right ballpark, but it's not good enough. Here's a question about morality. When you're talking about morality, do you use a word in English that starts with the letter M? That's a question about morality, but it's not a meta-ethical question. We need to be more precise. The worst thing, though, is that this distinction, normative ethics, applied ethics, meta-ethics, it's not useful. Sure, it's kind of interesting that utilitarianism is a normative ethical theory, and it's good that you explain the jargon if you're going to use it, but it doesn't help us establish the argument here. So we're wasting too much time and energy without really getting going. Overall, introduction, bad. I want to know when I read the introduction, what's your answer to the question? How are you going to argue for it? This student's given a bunch of fluff, some of which is false, and a distinction which they don't then use to answer the question. I still have no clue what their answer is. I don't know what the essay is going to show. That makes it worrying that the student doesn't know either. But let's move on. Firstly, people objected to utilitarianism that it makes us kill innocent people. I assume the student doesn't mean that exactly. Utilitarianism doesn't make you kill innocent people, but it might imply that it's the right thing to kill innocent people. Here, the student goes into some detail in a thought experiment he's got from the literature, or she's got from the literature. Very roughly, the thought experiment is you've got a choice between killing one person or someone else killing a bunch of people. I said that quite briefly. Here, the student said the same thing at considerable length. It would have been much better if they'd said it more concisely. It would have been even better if they'd chosen their own example rather than one they got from the literature. And that's because it would show that they really understood it, they really mastered the content. All of the interesting philosophical work is done in this 1.5 sentences. According to utilitarianism, you should kill the one person that reduced the amount of happiness in the world. Here the students made an error. I think they just mean increase rather than reduce. We're going to overlook that on the assumption that they've understood. Williamson thinks that utilitarianism is wrong about this. So it's not Williamson, it's Williams, different guy. But more to the point, that's not what Williams thinks. Williamson thinks something slightly different. So this student's kind of half understood the core reading. They've got a basic point and then they've gone off in their own direction, but they haven't really listened to what Williams is doing yet. It's a common mistake in this case. And it's good that the students at least got something from the reading, but the students missed the really good point here. And that's a shame. But I don't see why. So here, the student's going into an objection to the objection here. So this is a response to this. That's bad news. We've got a response to a point and the point, both in the same paragraph. You want to separate them out into different paragraphs. 1 point per paragraph, no more. That's because if you mush them all together into one paragraph, you can slide easily from one point to another. That makes your philosophy worse, and it makes it harder for the reader too. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened here. Because when they made their own point, they've actually made 3 different points, which are reasonably separate, and it's important to separate them, but they've all been mashed into the same paragraph, and the student who's written it seems to think they're all the same point. Let's pick the points out. So here, Williams is being selfish. Okay, that's not philosophy. We don't care whether Williams was a good guy or a bad guy in philosophy. We care whether his argument was good or bad. Williams being selfish, that's ad hominem. It has no place in philosophy. That's junk. Williams is ignoring the fact that there are other families of people. Basically, the point here is that Williams is ignoring a feature of his own example. Now, that's closer to philosophy because you're saying that Williams has committed a sort of philosophical error, his argument's bad. Actually, it's pretty implausible. I mean, you don't come up with an example, then ignore one of the major features of it, and it turns out to be false. It's not what Williams is ignoring at all. And here we have another point again. So it seems to a lot of people that genuinely good people don't worry about them having to do something that's wrong. Genuinely good people just do the right thing. So a genuinely good person wouldn't be worried about how they look or even whether they're doing something bad. They'll just pick up the gun, shoot someone, and save a bunch of other people. Okay, great. There's the start of something really good here. The student could take this and they could argue for it. Morality is such that you shouldn't be worried about getting your hands dirty. And they could argue that Williams overlooks this, that given this fact, Williams's argument fails, and they could use that to object to Williams' argument. But that's going to take at least a couple of paragraphs to make those 2 points, and it's all packed into, 2 clauses of a short sentence. So there's a little bit of credit the student's getting here for having some insight, but it's pitiful next to what they would have got had they taken the time to explain it, to illustrate it, to argue for it. Slow down. The second objection. Okay, so we've got the first objection here, the second objection here, 2 objections. And in fact, looking down, we've got just a list of objections, 5 in all. But let's go back to the top. What's the strongest objection to utilitarianism? Can it be overcome? That's asking you to talk about just one objection. So if you talk about 5 objections, you're not answering the question. Maybe you could have a debate about which of the 5 is strongest, but actually that's nowhere in here, and it would be a bad approach. So, first moral, answer the question. Technically, anything that doesn't answer the question is irrelevant. It's as if you didn't write it. So, if we're strictly following the rubric, it would be as if all of this wasn't there, and this was the entire essay. It's not actually quite how we mark. We're looking for ways to give the student credit, so we're going to read this and try and find something that's helpful, but it's not a good thing to not answer the question. Even if the question was, assess utilitarianism, and didn't require you to talk about one, still you should talk about one. In philosophy, you want to go into as much depth as possible. Here's an argument. Here's a problem with that argument. Here's an objection to that problem. Here's a response to that objection to that problem with that argument. That's depth. You're always talking about one argument or one objection. Here, we haven't gone into depth. And that's because the student has spread themselves too thinly. Instead of looking at just one argument, just one objection, they've actually thought up 5 different objections, and they've talked about none in sufficient depth. Every time you get a choice, go for depth over breadth. That's good philosophy. And it's absolutely required to get a decent grade as well. Anyway, the second objection was that utilitarians are very demanding. Great! Now what we want next is an explanation of that. It's just a name at the moment, demanding. And we want an illustration. And that's what we get. If we have to always act to maximise happiness, this will be difficult to work out. We have to do all sorts of difficult things. It's not a great explanation, but clearly the student understands the problem. And even better, we've got an example. Sadly, it's an example taken from the literature and it's not well explained. It would have been better if it was their own example, but there it is. Actually, if you can get away with using only one example throughout the essay and just sort of fine-tuning it for each different point, that shows a lot of skill and control. So the best of all would be to introduce your own example here and then just slightly modify it to use it here, if you can. At the very least, if you're introducing a new example, make sure you're making a new point with it, which the student is here. That's great. And then the student drops the ball. They use this idea of marginal utility. They plonk in a definition, which is actually not too bad, and I think they've copied it and changed a few words, because in the next sentence, they reveal that they don't understand what marginal utility means at all. Simple moral of the story, just write something only if you understand it. Then we have these two very curious little paragraphs. This is wrong. You don't have to, what's wrong? You don't have to give so much away just in order to be good. Charity is a thing where it is a supererogatory thing to give money away. This means it is more than... No idea what this paragraph's doing. This happens surprisingly often, a sentence which tails into nothing. I suspect this paragraph is a sort of cut and paste error, and actually the point here should have been part of this paragraph here. Something went wrong. Read your essays aloud, make sure this doesn't happen. This is getting no credit because you just don't know what it means. Also, utilitarianism is very alienating. Okay, so we've got a different objection here on our third or fourth one, depending how you count. Makes us kill innocent people, is very demanding, is alienating. But if we look closer, the alienating objection looks an awful lot like the demanding objection. It's not clear that the student knows the difference. When you've got two objections that sound very similar, you have to explain why they're different. Or if they're not different, only have one objection. Here it's explained too briefly. That's probably the key part of the problem. And once again, we've got the paragraph tailing out into nothing. However, okay, the student is really flailing here. Finally, the problem with utilitarianism is that it's too vague. It's an attempt to make things scientific, but science is precise and utilitarianism is not. Hey, this is kind of cool. This is an idea which you probably won't find in the core reading. You won't find in the core reading. It's an idea probably the students come up with themselves. That's great. They've got their own twist on things. But it's in the conclusion. No new ideas in the conclusion. The reason is that you don't want to compress those new ideas. You want them out into the open space of the main body of the essay up here, where you've got time to object to them and respond to the objections. You've got time to compare them with other problems, other arguments. This is just far too compressed. I mean, check out what this is. It's an accusation. It's a bunch of questions. And then it's a claim that utilitarianism can't answer these questions, so it's hopeless. But you didn't explain why it had to answer those questions. You didn't show that it can't answer those questions. So, good idea here. Execution, just lacking. It's just not there. All there is the outline of an idea. There's not really an argument here. Finally, we've got a bibliography, which is incomplete. Now, we don't worry all that much about the bibliography, but, or rather, students worry more than we do about it. But you do want to get enough information so that the reader can go and read what you read for themselves. So Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy is probably a pretty bad source most of the time because it's too thin, it doesn't have the required depth. And here we haven't got enough information to know which part of that huge encyclopedia that the person's read. Lecture notes, it's kind of vaguely okay to put lecture notes in the bibliography, but say which ones and try and avoid it. Right? Read the core reading, the arguments are there, you can get it from there. Overall, this is not a good essay. It's not a good essay at all. The students got some basic understanding. They've got this distinction here, that's nice. They haven't defined utilitarianism anywhere, but they've got at least a decent sense of what it means. Not precise enough, probably, but they've got a rough idea. They don't think it's something about, I don't know, practical dogs or something like that. They've clearly got the very basics, at least, of the reading. They've imported some ideas from readings elsewhere in the course, which is nice. And that's about the good things that you can say about it. So this is not an E. The students not completely misunderstood what's going on here. They've got some rudimentary understanding, but there's no way this is an A or an A minus or anything close to that. Hasn't got the depth. It goes too quickly over complex ideas. It doesn't have objections to those ideas. It just states them and doesn't consider what problems there might be with them or how you'd respond to those problems. It's just thin. So this could at most get a B, but because of the errors that the student has made, not understanding exactly what Williams is saying, the problems down here, the fact that this isn't developed, that's dragged it down further, and it's going to be a mid C or to a low C. Okay, so that wasn't a great essay. Hopefully the next one will be better. Hope that was helpful for you. If it was, we're doing another video on an essay that's probably going to turn out to be a bit better. You can go and check that out. Thanks a lot. Bye.